And you are listening to By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik in Washington, D.C. I'm your host, Eugene Puryear, and as always, we're your guide to connecting the political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
By any means necessary.
And we are very happy here now, switching gears to some degree, to be joined by Elizabeth Kucinich. Many of you may know her as the wife of former Congressman Dennis Kucinich. She's also someone who is very deep in the worlds of food policy, sustainability, so many different things. I don't even know 100% where to start, but you were the former director of policy at the Center for Food Safety. You're on the board of the Rodale Institute and also work with organic farmers. So, Elizabeth, thank you so much for joining the show.
Thank you. Great to be with you.
And it's great to have you back. And I wanted to talk about something that recently made some news. And you made a trip some weeks ago here to Syria. I believe you were on the trip as well with Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard was also on that trip. Some of us saw just a little bit about it here in America. But what did you see, or what is some of what you saw? I'm sure you saw a lot. And what do you think people who have only sort of followed the CNN Washington Post version of Syria may be interested to know?
Great, thank you. Yeah, this actually was my 6th trip over 10 years, so
wow.
I've got to know Syria quite well over that time, and it really is the most extraordinary country with the most wonderful people. And I think the main thing that is the first way to start this conversation is that there's not a civil war happening in Syria. It's absolutely not a civil war. There may have been small uprising at the beginning, but that has totally been infiltrated now by extremist groups. And much of the country has been taken over by those groups. And very sadly, our country and others are supporting them. So what we're sold on as a civil war and, tribes are always been like this and the Middle East always in conflict. No, actually, this has been completely manipulated. Syria is being destroyed systematically, city by city, town by town, dismantled quite literally, thousands of factories that have been dismantled, the pieces and parts being sold off and transported across the border into Turkey, and goodness knows where they've gone. And so this is not about democracy movement. This is really about the installation of something far more sinister. So being there and being with the people was extraordinary, and be happy to talk more about anything you're interested in.
No, absolutely. And before I ask you anything specific, I just wonder, I mean, when you're on trips like this, do you encounter Western journalists? I mean, I always wonder, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the CNN. I mean, it almost seems like they're just willing to sort of outsource a lot of their reporting. Are they there and just not reporting it? Are they not there? I mean, I'm always curious why so much of even just a little bit you just mentioned there never makes it into these reports.
Yeah. I think that a lot of Western media really takes their sources from different places. You see a lot of reporting that happens from Turkey or from Jordan or from some other country that's, involved in the crisis, but in a very different kind of way. They'd have their press releases that come and they read, and then they put out from again, different sources that are from an ideological bent that they're bent towards. So there's a desire to want to learn about, quote, humanitarian issues, and there's some really, really dire things happening on the ground. But there's also a great deal of fabricated things that are happening as a means of propaganda to support these terrorist groups. And I think that when we think about militants, we think in terms of, just people brandishing weapons and behaving like horrible, violent idiots. But actually, there's an entire orchestrated approach to this. There's a lot of deft communication. There's a lot of smooth and slick relationships that have been developed and forged on many, many different levels. And so we have to be really aware of that. Now, on my last trip a couple of weeks ago, no, I didn't encounter any Western media. I also didn't seek it out. But in trips before, the last time I was there was in 2013, when there really was a lot of shelling happening in and around Damascus. And there were a lot of media, but, they're in the 5-star hotels and they're in their happy, safe zones that aren't that safe, but they're a lot safer than really being out in the middle of the conflict. And then generally getting their news feeds of what they're meant to be saying from somebody, again, who's outside of the country. So you've got your personality inside who's showing I'm here, but the news is actually being generated from across the border somewhere. So we have to really be vigilant about what it is that we're hearing and who we're hearing it from, and then who they're hearing that news from. So I went out this time and, as always, met with a major cross-section of society, from people on the streets that you randomly bump into to, official meetings with heads of the church from all denominations, heads of the Muslim community, We went to Aleppo. We were in East Aleppo, went through all of the sadly destroyed city there, and also went into the western side of the city and met with people who are still living a life of a regular-ish city that has been under conflict, but nevertheless is still vibrant and there. So there's a big cross-section.
And obviously Syrian refugees have been big in the news here in the United States, and certainly we hear a lot about people leaving. But what is the situation for internally displaced persons in Syria? Of which I think there's many, hundreds of thousands.
Absolutely. And let's really look at the refugee crisis. People are fleeing from militant-held areas into government-held areas. It's not the other way around.
Right.
They're fleeing from the people that we're arming, and we have to really take note of that. So let's look at the IDP issue. There's an amazing domestic response that's happened both from local people. Say, I was in a camp on the eastern side of Aleppo, where I talked to many young people who are volunteers from the western part of the city who drove in every day, who tried to help the people in whatever way they could. The Red Crescent were present, the United Nations are present, the government is there. There's a lot of charitable things that are happening, but at the same time, Syria is under economic sanctions, and so there's only so much that the international community either want to do or can do because of these kinds of sanctions. So we need to really be addressing that issue. Now, the first time I went to Syria was back in 2006. And that was because Israel and Lebanon had a fracas, and Israel had dropped an enormous amount of weapons onto the southern part of Lebanon and had destroyed a runway in Beirut airport. So I had to fly into Damascus in order to get into Lebanon. And that was my entree into really thinking about this issue. Now, while I was in Damascus, I learned how Syria had taken in 2 million Iraqi refugees. Back in 2006, they were providing healthcare, they were providing education, and had no support from the international community because they're under sanctions. So we see a compounded, our foreign policy and what we've been doing in the Middle East to manipulate some crazy plan, what that is doing country after country and destabilizing citizenships and also, just the general geopolitical issues and situation out there. So they already had taken in millions of refugees, and now there's all these displaced people who are having to be, taken care of and looked after. We're also in Lebanon, this trip, that has taken in over 1.5 million refugees. And if you think of Lebanon, it's not a country the size of the United States. It's a really small country. It has a population of 3.5 million, and they've taken in 1.5 million additional refugees. It's extraordinary.
Almost half the population. Well, we're going to take a break here on By Any Means Necessary. We will be back with Elizabeth Kucinich after this. I'm your host, Eugene Puryear. Stay with us.
By any means necessary.
Welcome back to By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik in Washington, D.C. I'm your host, Eugene Puryear, and as always, we're your guide to connecting the political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us. And we are continuing our conversation with Elizabeth Kucinich, who has recently returned from Syria, which is what we were talking about a little bit in our last segment there, and perhaps a little bit more here, and then a little bit more than that as we start to move from the international down the chain of localities, I guess, if you will, to the regional and the local. But, one sort of interesting piece I wanted to ask you about this is, to what extent, because this has been such a polarizing issue for anti-war sentiment in the United States for a range of different reasons. But I wonder if sort of at this stage in the game, it almost seems like it's whatever people think about how it started or the way it started or what they think about the Assad regime or whatever, that it's pretty clear right now that this is a proxy war being fueled primarily by us and friends of the United States, and that's the key vector. Could this be an issue that could lead to some revived anti-war sentiment? I know that Representative Gabbard has the Stop Arming Terrorists Act and different pieces like that. Could this be maybe a lever to start talking more about foreign policy issues in the progressive movement?
I hope so. What the establishment in Washington and the country here has really been very clever in doing is taking the policy of a responsibility to protect, so to protect citizens and civilians, and then use that as a cover for going into war. We saw that in Libya, the threat that, Gaddafi's going to do this to his people. He may do it. We have to jump in now. And that wasn't what was actually happening. That was used as a cover to wage war on a country in order to have a, quote, regime change, which then installed militants who filled in the vacuum. What the hell are we doing? And so we need to really be looking at how the media and how many different people within the foreign policy community that have their own agendas are using the heart of the American people in order to gain traction for something which is actually completely antithetical to the premise and the ethics of those people who are then get very confused and end up supporting it. So, this is about spin and media and propaganda and, smoke and mirrors all the time. And, looking at going into Iraq, for example. Look at what happened there. It was linked to 9/11. There's absolutely no connections, and yet people get this confusion in their heads, and off we go. We're back to the races again.
Yeah, well, and I think that's a great point. And let me also ask you this, because I think one area that we also don't get a lot of information about that I think leads to some of, the positions people make is the position of President Assad and his regime on moving forward. I mean, sort of the way it's presented here is that, sort of he and the people immediately around him are only interested in maintaining their own power to the exclusion of all other things, which seems to just sort of to some degree be belied by the fact that they're involved in all these negotiations around the world with all these different people.
Oh, it sounds so different from our political system, doesn't it?
Yeah, right, I know. So crazy that anyone would ever want to, be elected and stay in power in the time they were elected for. But nevertheless, your recent trip there, I mean, what were you able to glean perhaps about ways the Syrian government is looking to ameliorate the conflict?
So, it's interesting because I've, as I say, I've been going there for now over a decade, and that was 6 trips. So it's not that I'm there all the time, but it's been interesting to see over that period the shifts. And the one thing about the Syrian people is that there's a real consciousness about being Syrian. It's not a country that's built upon sectarian divides of us versus them inside the borders. That's not the fabric of the country. But that is what we and policies and actually militants from over 100 countries are now fighting there. And, this is now a very manipulated situation. But Syrians are saying, both from the government side and the heads of the opposition and people on the opposition, the opposition whose voices have actually been quelled quite a lot because they've been killed off not by the government but by the militants, because you can't be a moderate within this situation. Right. You're dangerous to the militants who are there really to proselytize a very narrow view of an interpretation of a religious sect. It's not the religion of Islam. It's really a very small sect within that. And if you don't adhere to that, then you're a danger to their voice that you're conveniently got rid of. And so I talked to a great deal of a number of people who had been, say, in East Aleppo and had, for the last 4 years, had been occupied by militant forces. And they told me in very minute detail about awful things that had happened to them, the rape and the torture, but also when people had tried to leave those areas, how they just were shot because the militants needed a civilian population to be there in order to, do whatever they were doing. On the other side of it, I met with a man who's a minister within the Ministry of Reconciliation within the Syrian government. Now, he's a leader, again, of the opposition within Syria. His son was assassinated, and he was assassinated because he was a moderate. Now, this man is extraordinary, and the work that the ministry is doing is going around village by village, town by town, helping people to get back together again. And I went to a community center in Damascus where women who had lost their husbands on either side of the battle came together and danced. Very, very down-to-earth, human-to-human contact to build the humanity back into a situation. We often talk about, trying to win over hearts and minds and win this, quote, war on terror through bombing countries and regime change. And that's not the way that societies evolve. Societies evolve through people, through human contact, through education, through very much more heartfelt motives and means. And to be able to experience and to learn about all of the different things that are happening on the ground, Syrian-driven. When you look at, you've got the international militants coming in and then Syria responding very, very domestically in this very human way to reconcile communities. It's really very powerful and extraordinary.
Mm-hmm. I once met a nun who was working on reconciliation who showed the most amazing slideshow of like going into these free Syrian army places by herself with the white flag of surrender to get in there and then basically having these conversations about the need for reconciliation among Syrians. And it just sort of seems like it almost seems like that's another piece of what America, but also many other big countries maybe don't see. I mean, everything's about, what is the next set of like 8-party talks doing X, Y, and Z, and then very little change seems to change on the ground. I mean, it seems like this sort of community by community reconciliation really should be the tip of the spear, not just sort of the add-on.
It's very, very practical and absolutely. And I mean, what you introduced this show talking about, 1,000 people a year being shot by our police force in the United States. That's a terrible situation. We need to be dealing with police-community relations issues. We need to be dealing with them at a human community level, not from a policy level, of course, to make sure it doesn't happen, but we need to be able to create those relationships so we can actually learn from methods of peace and reconciliation processes from around the world and bring them back home as well. Never before has our situation in America, I think, been quite as fragmented and so manipulated to fragment us as a community into different groups that really are supposedly now warring factions. Now we're using words, but what will it be in the future? And strengthening the government. I mean, the government, quite frankly, now is turning into a regime here in America, and we have a resistance to that. So, there's a lot to learn from different experiences that doesn't come from judgment, but really comes from being open to learning about real human responses to very, very real issues.
I'm glad you raised that point because it reminds me of something that President Obama said towards the end of his term in one of his final speeches in relationship to Trump being elected. And he said, one thing is that there's a lot of Democrats who live in red states or red areas that don't even talk to their own neighbors about politics. So basically, how can you really be that upset that they voted for someone you think is terrible when you had no sort of dialogue between them? And I mean, I think one of the biggest questions that is facing the progressive community in America is related to this, whether or not there's sort of any situation by which, whether someone be in Congress or whatever, that people should work with Donald Trump. And I think that there's been sort of some feelings that, we should pay him back for what he did to Obama, do nothing under no circumstances. There are others who have come out and said, let's look for points of agreement. And if we can get it, we can get it. And it seems to sort of speak to this issue beyond sort of the Trump Democrats in Congress of like what it really means to find points of agreement amongst ourselves across this sort of red state, blue state thing.
So, we're really doing, I think, internally now what we have been doing internationally. We find a big dragon to want to slay who's leading a different country, make everything that's evil projected onto them, and we think if only we could get rid of them, everything would be great. Well, sure enough, leaders have a lot of power, but just because they're in office doesn't mean they are the power. The power is in the people, and that's not being all flaky and hippie. It's with us, every single interaction, every single day. We determine the conversations that we have in our own lives. We determine what we do with our money. We determine what we do with our votes. We haven't elected a dictator, whether he took the election, whether he won it fairly, whatever. He's there right now. How are we going to deal with that? We have to be, in my opinion, very, very strong on policy. We have to know what we stand for, and we have to push what we stand for. And we have to push it with our own integrity and with our own courage in a way that we would want to be listened to should somebody else be trying to do the same. We have to address people with respect and integrity because that's how we want to be addressed as well. So if we can be strong on policy, clear on our vision, clear on where we want to go, and then be softer on attacking someone else, we actually then might create an opening to have somebody change their mind or to be able to actually engage and start to shift a system. So not to be so manipulated into feeling like we've just elected a god who's all powerful. No, we haven't. Come on. So he's putting out executive orders. Half of them won't stand and the rest of them won't be voted on and, you know, whatever. Let's really get active and get real here. It's very convenient to switch off and say, this is a problem and I can't do anything about it. But fortunately, people are doing something else. They're waking up. And from a very, very high sort of macro view, one could even say that Trump is doing a great thing for the country because he's helping us to wake up. He's helping us to step into our power. He's helping us to actually engage in a political system that for decades has been going down the drains. And now we can actually start to take our own power and for heaven's sake, get elected, vote for something, help somebody, do something in your community, talk to your neighbor. Don't worry about if they're Republican or if they're, whatever it is you do or don't like. They're a human being and they're your neighbor and they're part of your community. Now let's get real. Now, when Dennis was in Congress and he was there for 16 years, he was always over the other side of the aisle. He was always talking to people. He was building the most extraordinary coalitions and managed to help get a lot of things either stopped or passed, depending on what we were trying to do at the time, because you have this slow drip relationship building, education on something. He would always go to the floor of the House with a big pile of letters to help people understand an issue or briefing papers or whatever it might be. And it wasn't about red, blue, green, yellow, purple. It was really about trying to reach people where they are. And if there is an opinion that somebody holds that you find particularly egregious, talk to them about it in a loving way, in the way that if somebody looks at you and sees maybe you're doing something wrong, you would want them to talk to you with respect. And we can move, maybe we can move the world in that way. And when you look at an international policy, when we see things we don't like, they cut off diplomatic relations, they stop talking to the leaders, they stop communicating. Well, if you have an issue with somebody in your family, okay, if you cut them out, that's not the most healthy thing for your family. We've got to really make it real, but make it real on a policy level now. So take it back to the human experience, be empathetic and intelligent and move from there.
Well, I think it's certainly a good point, and certainly I think that's something that, it's interesting. I think about Congressmen Kucinich, you think about Bernie Sanders, the same thing. A lot of Republicans say very positive things about them, and that to some degree it was easier to deal with them because you knew where they stood. It wasn't a whole lot of backroom dealing, smoke-filled room kind of stuff. It was like, if we agree, we agree. If we disagree, we disagree. And we're going to work on this issue, but not on that issue. And it actually, in some ways, was like a more functional form of governance to have people have strong views than this sort of will-o'-the-wisp deal where you just never know. I mean, you look at how these Democrats are acting now. One day I can be, 100% I'm going to destroy all of Trump's nominees, and the next day, I'm voting for one of them for who knows what. But it's almost like a fake politics that's not tangible.
So there's the question then, where is one's allegiance lying? Is it with the party or is it with the country? And it has to be with the country. And it can't be about power politics that my side's in power, no, your side's in power, oh dear. It's really got to be about what is best for America. And what's best for America is when we come together and we try to make common sense decisions. And we try to move the country forward to a vision rather than destroy each other because one or other is or isn't in control. And we have to get out of this power dynamics and really into leading a country, because internal fragmentation, be it inside the House in Congress or inside our communities based on some ridiculous notion of team play, is just going to break down the country. And we need to look at being Americans. Well, I clearly have a British accent. I'm here. We have to look at the fabric of the society and what we love about this country. And one of the founding statement of this country, the motto was "E pluribus unum," out of many, one. And that is on the House of Representatives in the ceiling, and it's over a big eagle. And what we like to show is an eagle needs a left and a right wing in order to be able to fly. And so let's come together in that body politic. In the middle of that eagle, there's a body. It has a brain. It has, functioning muscles. And let's look at how we can bring them together and really make this thing work.
We should do some sort of quiz of Congress people to see how many of them can actually say what that term actually means, not asking one aide or looking at their cell phone. I think that might be an interesting piece. Well, let me ask you this quickly before we have to close here. One of the things overhanging a lot of this, obviously the Middle East, people talk about oil. We're talking about local politics. Raise the thing in with Maryland. I mean, how important do you think from the point of view of climate change and sustainability, these sort of local and state level initiatives are to making progress irregardless of the national government?
They're absolutely essential. I mean, really the power, as I've said, is in us, it's in our communities and in our states. And that all of that is open to us, and by getting into that system, we can shift everything. I mean, I work primarily in food policy, though you wouldn't know it necessarily from this conversation. And the reason I work in food policy is because every time when we eat every single day, we're determining dollars, and we're also determining the way that somebody is stewarding the earth. And then that relates to everything: water, air, land, human health. Everything's related to our plate. Well, when we look at energy, everything's related to our home, our business, our immediate environment. If we look at ourselves as agents for change in our own life, if we all are able to do that, the system shifts no matter who's in power. Yeah,
well, I think that's a very good point. Seeing Sonny Perdue is going to potentially be the agricultural secretary. I mean, beyond the fact that he's like a huge agribusiness guy, it just says something to me that the least attention of any confirmation hearing is being spent on the Secretary of Agriculture, despite the fact that we all must eat.
Mm-hmm. Well,
crazy.
You've just put our attention onto it now, so.
Yeah, his former governor of Georgia, too, Sonny Perdue, is just, I can't even get started on this guy. He was a big immigrant raid guy, and who even knows? But he's got $250,000 while governor from agribusiness companies, so that's all.
Well, federal policies are really important, but the most important thing is how we as individuals choose to live.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I mean, I think that there's a lot of truth to that, and certainly I think that's what people are afraid of. I mean, with the GMO labeling bills or whatever it may be, that sort of from the bottom up, people are changing the way where they get their food, how they want it to be presented to them, how they want it to be cooked, what they want to know about it, and it's sort of to some degree, whatever it may be, once you do it one place, you got to do it another place. You do it in one country, you got to do it in another country. And it just seems like we're starting to having some proliferation here of citizen-based activism making a difference.
Oh, absolutely. And it's making a really big difference. And, we need to acknowledge that on every single level of the political system. And again, it doesn't matter. It does matter who's in office, of course. But, what the innovation that people in real communities are showing and shifting business models, shifting food systems, shifting health systems, that's where it really is.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much for joining us. That was Elizabeth Kucinich, who, as we mentioned, is just back from Syria, among many other things. So we thank her for joining us here on the show on By Any Means Necessary here on Radio Sputnik in Washington, D.C. We're